I gave this presentation about 2 months ago at Texas A&M Commerce to the physics department. I won't tell you what the result was until the end, but you can, actually it was very positive, I'll give you that clue. But I'll tell you about that when we finish, and you can be thinking about how physicists would respond to this kind of evidence. There were about 30 professors and about 20 grad students, and actually it was a slightly abbreviated version of this presentation. And I'm on college campuses about once a month across the country, and we were just up at the University of Akron, and we were speaking there each evening for a week. We had a nasty letter published in the newspaper about midway through the week, and it doubled our crowds. Well, we had this all set and ready to go. All right, here we go, getting close. All right, we're going to be talking about the record of the rocks this evening. And the main theme, as indicated, is going to be the coexistence of humans and dinosaurs. The evolutionists tell us that when we dig down in the rocks, we see the progressive development of life recorded as if recorded by a tape recorder over long periods of time. Over 500 million years, the record that is indicated in the fossil record. And so we're talking primarily about that record, the sedimentary rock record that covers the continents. There's an average of about 1.5 miles of sedimentary rock that covers the continents. It has billions and billions of dead things in it. It's laid down by water, and it covers all the continents. Now, I know a good explanation for that. But there are alternative views that we'll be considering this evening. Is this 1.5 miles of sediment on the average that covers all the continents the result of gradual buildup over millions of years that records the development of life over that period? Or is this a rapid, catastrophic deposition that is a flood deposit? Now, those are two very different views, and we should be able to look at the rock record and tell the difference. Of course, if you believe philosophically in naturalism and you don't want to submit to a creator, then you have to have a slow, gradual explanation for the record of the rocks. I think when you look at the record of the rocks, it's obvious that it was catastrophic, and that stratigraphy indicates a flood deposit and challenges naturalism. Now, we won't have time this evening to look at all of the evidence for flood deposits, but we're going to look particularly at the evidence of coexistence of humans and dinosaurs, which I think is central and critical, and even evolutionists would acknowledge it. But the evolutionary representation of what you find when you dig down in this sedimentary rock record looks like this, the geologic time scale. And down at the bottom you have the very simple animals, and you get more complex as you go up. This is that progression of life supposed to be recorded over millions of years. The biggest problem with this is that it's found only in the textbooks. You can't dig down in the earth and find this complete record anywhere, as any knowledgeable geologist knows, though often you have to get to grad school to understand that. But notice the statement by Leighton Judson, a standard geology text, that says, because we cannot find sedimentary rocks representing all Earth time neatly in one convenient area, we must piece together the rock sequence from locality to locality. It is not found anywhere. It's pieced together. Some over here in Texas and some over in China and some in England. This process of tying one rock sequence in one place to another in some other place is known as correlation. And so it's correlated from various places and not found in any one spot. As the Encyclopedia Britannica says, the end product of correlation is a mental abstraction called the geologic column. Now, many students taking earth science, junior high, high school, even college courses don't grasp this, that it's a mental abstraction, it's a construct. Notice the comment about this by R.H. Rastell, again in the Encyclopedia Britannica from Cambridge. He says, it cannot be denied that geologists are here arguing in a circle. And he's explaining how they come up with this correlation. How do they know what goes on top and what goes on bottom? Because they're picking it from various places. It's not because of where it's found geographically. He says the succession of organisms has been determined by study of the remains embedded in the rocks, and the relative ages of the rocks are determined by the organisms they contain. Now we can see that circular process, or illustrate it somewhat oversimplified, but it works like this. A person says, I have a primitive fossil here. Well, how do you know that's a primitive fossil? Well, it's found in an old rock. All right, I understand that. But how do you know that this is an old rock? Well, it's got a primitive fossil in it. And we're obviously not proving anything, but this is the correlation process and the way it works. Notice Putman and Bassett's description of this in the textbook Geology, and these are standard geology textbooks used across the country. A rock that had an early form, and notice the assumption, this presumes the thing to be proved to start with, but it's an early form, so where does it go? It goes on the bottom, doesn't it? Clearly older than rocks containing later forms, which would go on the top. Furthermore, all rocks that had the early form, no matter how far apart those rocks were geographically, would have to be the same age. So it's not where, but is it early or late in terms of the evolutionary assumption. In this way, our geologic timetable came into being. Without the theory of evolution and the interdisciplinary science of paleontology, it could not exist. So you use evolution to stack, to order the correlation. And then once you get it stacked, you turn around and say, see, the proof of evolution. Well, no, you have to have evolution in order to build it. Now, again, I'm somewhat oversimplifying, and there are correlations in local sequences that you can follow physically, but when you're talking about the whole column, you're talking about correlation across continents and across oceans, and that's strictly based on the assumptions of evolution. The detailed picture in the textbook could not exist without evolution. You must assume the thing to be proved. I think it is useful as a model, but I think we can look at a number of problems with this. Some perhaps you haven't thought about. When you're looking at this, you see mostly vertebrates, obviously, and when people think about fossils, well, yeah, that's the impressive fossils. The truth of the matter, relatively speaking, vertebrates are virtually non-existent relative to the other fossils. This is a very skewed picture. The fossil record, 95% of it involves marine invertebrates, animals without backbones, and they're in the ocean. And then most of what's not included in the 95%, the other 4.5, is plants and algae. Far less than 1% involves the vertebrates, 0.025%, about 1/100th of 1%. And so when we're talking about this 1.5 miles of sediment that's covering the continents, we're looking primarily at marine invertebrates. Well, why isn't that represented in the geologic column? Somebody might get the idea we're talking about a flood deposit here, a marine flood deposit. Well, yes, that's what it looks like when you represent it correctly, but they don't. The founding fathers of geology all understood that this was a flood deposit, and that's not represented in the textbook as well. Nicholas Steno is referred to as the father of modern stratigraphy. He's one of the heroes of geology, and he'll be in all of the textbooks. Quoting from Dot Batten's textbook, Evolution of the Earth, besides correctly interpreting fossils, the result was formulation of the most basic principles for analysis of Earth history. Steno showed great insight. Almost 300 years ago, he came up with the explanation that we still use today, and he came up with the means of interpreting the strata. And you have to memorize his 12 axioms, or you're not going to pass stratigraphy. And if you get a stratigraphy student who's halfway through the course, he can just rattle them off, all 12 of them, because that's the way you do it. They haven't really improved on it that much. He says, Steno's axioms provide the ultimate basis for practically all interpretation of Earth history, so their importance can hardly be overemphasized. What they don't tell you is that he thought the whole deposit, 1.5 miles in the average, covering the continents, was done in a year-long series of catastrophes produced by the flood. Here is a picture of his book. When I was doing work at Cambridge in England, they had one of the original editions of his book under glass in the Oxford Library, not in the Oxford, in the Trinity Library. The flypiece dedication page says, dedicated to the proof of the Noachian deluge. Now that's where he was coming from, which they don't tell you. One of the things people say when you mention the idea of, well, maybe a flood did this, is, well, that's crazy. There's no way a flood would explain what we see in the geologic record. You've got all these separate layers and different groups and segregated groups of animals, and a flood would just make a big mishmash. Of course, they don't know much about floods, which they reveal in such statements, even local floods. And how many of you have seen a universal flood? Don't think so. And it really doesn't correlate that well. You double the velocity of the water, the speed of the water, and you increase the carrying and eroding factor by a factor of 12. The power to carry and to erode 12 times when you increase it twice, or increase it once, double it. It doesn't correlate necessarily with just local floods. It works in multiples. But this was his concept, and it allowed him to write the rules well enough 300 years earlier that we still haven't improved on them that much. He understood geology, and this is what he thought was the best explanation. Building on that, the book Genesis Flood was published in 1961 by Whitcomb and Morris, and they explained, in terms of all we know in 1961, and what we've learned since then, I think, just confirms that. And I think they provided an excellent explanation for the geologic record. John C. McCampbell, who was professor and head of the Department of Geology at the University of Southeastern Louisiana, wrote the foreword. Now, he is an evolutionist and a naturalist, but he fairly appraised this explanation and said the facts of geology do fit, and that the authors have built a very strong case for this explanation and a serious challenge to the standard explanation. Now, he didn't say their view fits and ours doesn't, but that's the way I would have said it. I think it explains much more and much better. Well, but how does a flood produce these segregated groups of animals that we do see? And when you look at this column, yes, you see groups that you can identify as the Cambrian, and other groups you can identify as the Silurian. And how did that come to be? You don't find them all in one place, stacked in that beautiful order. Well, when we look at the way animals live in the world today, we see natural habitats segregate, so that typically you don't find bears and lions living together, do you? Now, you used to back in Bible time, but today you see the ecology has shifted and it's changed. I think the flood buried animals where they lived, and they lived separately from other animals. You don't typically find antelope bones in a coral reef. Not because they're millions of years apart, they just live in different places. And as the floodwaters of worldwide flood engulfed the world, it would bury organisms where they lived, and we would see that as the floodwaters rose and buried these animals, they would preserve that habitat in which they lived, and I think it simply reflects the environment in which you found the world at the time of the flood, and it buried it that way. The different groups were buried separately, not because they're millions of years apart, but because some of them lived on the ocean bottom, and some of them lived up on the edge of the ocean, and some of them lived in the swamps, and some of them lived on the plains. Not all stacked in one place, different places around the world. But typically, if you find a swamp here and an ocean bottom over there, which one is going to be lower? Usually, the ocean bottom. Not always. And so a general order would be predicted, but certainly not this skewed, arranged, conceptual correlation that is pictured so often in the textbooks that is useless as proof of evolution. It's circular logic, which is not useful as proof. It is useful, though, I believe, as a model. Now, what in science, a model is, we understand, the beginning presupposition. Here's an idea. Now, the fact that you illustrate the idea is not proof. But the illustration will serve as a means of testing. And I think that's what the geologic column is useful for. We can test that against the real world to see if the facts fit. And how would you test it? Well, let's allow the evolutionist to describe how this test should proceed. Stephen Stanley of Johns Hopkins refers to topsy-turvy fossils. This would test it, he says. This would disprove evolution. Any topsy-turvy sequence of fossils would force us to rethink our theory. We'll look at a more complete rendition of that quote before we're finished. And by the way, the quotes that we're using are all in a handout that will be available for you, that is here. To illustrate, there are animals that are supposed to be at the bottom of the geologic column that may be found up. That would be a topsy-turvy fossil. Well, animals that are supposed to be down near the bottom early in the development are often found at the top. They're what we call living fossils, and so they really don't like to talk about this part of it that much. Niles Eldridge, a cohort of Stephen Gould, curator of invertebrate paleontology at the American Museum of Natural History, says there seems to have been almost no change in any part we can compare. These animals that began back at the bottom of the column, still alive today, and there's not been any change. He says we've not completely solved the riddle of living fossils. They should have evolved, and they shouldn't be alive. They should have been replaced. And he gives a number of illustrations. For example, the horseshoe crab. Now, you see the fossil inset down at the bottom. That's supposed to be 424 million years old. And here's the modern one up near the top, and that's just almost identical. And it would look more identical if we had more dark in here, but anyway, you can see fairly well. They're all over the place, millions of them. That's a topsy-turvy fossil. Keith Thompson, president of the Academy of Natural Sciences, says the horseshoe crabs of today look, of the fossil record, look quite like the modern forms. The last fossils became extinct 50 million years ago. Well, of course, fossils don't become extinct, but I understand what he's talking about. 50 million years, and you've got no fossils. But they're all over the place. Now, that doesn't fit their explanation, because when they quit making fossils, then they're supposed to be extinct, right? Not the way it works. Maybe the most famous living fossil is the coelacanth. This is a fossil fish that lived with the dinosaurs. Here we see Keith Thompson again writing a book about this. He says this is a fish thought to be extinct for 70 million years. A fish, a coelacanth, an animal that thrived concurrently with the dinosaurs. And they look quite like modern forms. Yes, we have found them. They're alive. He says, though, we have no coelacanths younger than the late Cretaceous. Now, the late Cretaceous is as late as we find the dinosaurs. We find some above that, which they don't talk about, but not a whole lot. And so they went extinct same time, basically, the dinosaurs did. And no fossils for 65 million years. And now then we found over 600 of them swimming around in the ocean now. There's something a little fishy about that, isn't there? Here's a news account of a fossil that was found alive in Sydney, Australia, several years ago. David Noble went out on a holiday hike, stepped off the beaten path into the prehistoric age, standing amid trees thought to have disappeared 150 million years ago. Here's a Jurassic Park tree that's been gone since Jurassic Park. The discovery is the equivalent of finding a small dinosaur still alive on the earth, said Carrick Chambers, director of the Royal Botanical Gardens. One of the most dramatic and significant living fossils are graptolites, which everybody knows about, right? Anybody ever heard of a graptolite? Well, if you were a petroleum geologist, you would know all about them. These are very important. These are index fossils, and these particular graptolites are index fossils of the Cambrian. That's the bottom layer in the geologic column. And an index fossil is a fossil that allows you to say, that's a Cambrian graptolite. Therefore, I know this is a Cambrian rock. That dates the rock as Cambrian, because it only lived during this period, died out, and went extinct, except now then they have found them alive, this index fossil of the lowest layer. Quoting from Nature, again of several years ago, this is not new knowledge, and you'll never see it in the textbook. All paleontologists dream of finding a living fossil. Noel Dilly seems to have done so. Graptolites are arguably the most important zone fossil of the lower Paleozoic. This is far from an esoteric issue. Supposed to be gone, hundreds of millions of years, still alive. Well, what this does, obviously, is falsify the idea that if you don't find it above a certain point in the geologic record, it went extinct. Now, just over and over again, we've proved that that's not so, and yet they still say that, no matter how many examples you find. These are topsy-turvy fossils, the ones that are supposed to be up that are found down. That does falsify the extinction hypothesis. But there's so many of them, they've kind of gotten immune to that. And they say, wait a minute, that's not what you need to find. What you need to find is things that are supposed to be the other way around. Things that are supposed to be up that are found down. Now, maybe you can have things living on the razor edge of extinction for 70 million years and no fossils after having a bunch of them for a long time, and then still be alive. That's incredible, but they can imagine that. But how in the world can you take something that didn't develop till hundreds of millions of years later and get it back down at the bottom? Now, that would just rip it, wouldn't it? And they acknowledge that, that's not going to work. Richard Dawkins of Oxford, one of the most vicious anti-creationists, in his book The Blind Watchmaker, says we should be very surprised, for example, to find fossil humans appearing in the record before mammals are supposed to have evolved. If a single well-verified mammal skull were to turn up in 500 million-year-old rocks, our whole modern theory of evolution would be utterly destroyed. Things supposed to be up, found down. Now, I think the logic is virtually the same going the other way, but coming this way, they just give up at this point. Now, that sounds like a very scientific way to proceed. Here's a test, and science proceeds by such test, and they're verified or falsified. But it's not quite as simple as you think, because we found this kind of thing all over the place. For example, near LaSalle, Utah, here are perfectly modern human bones 50 feet down in the Dakota Sandstone, the same formation that you find at Dinosaur National Monument. This Dakota Sandstone is famous for its dinosaurs. Well, they must have fallen down a crack in the rock. No, we don't have to find the crack. You just know that has to happen. Or they crawled back in a cave that collapsed on them. Of course, there are no broken bones. Well, maybe they were mining and it collapsed on them. Again, no broken bones. We've got 10 of these skeletons now, and 5 of them were males, 4 of them were females, 1 was an infant, and no tools and no broken bones. It doesn't sound like a mine cave-in to me. But whatever, it has to be an intrusional burial because we know humans and dinosaurs didn't live together. And so the real key phrase in this statement is if it's well verified. And guess what? It ain't going to be verified. Whatever it takes, it won't be. Well, we've done a good bit of work at this site. We went back to see if it could be well verified. This is near LaSalle, Utah, about 25 miles south of Moab. And it's an open pit copper mine. And about where you see the backhoe is where most of the skeletons were found, a little bit to the left and then at that spot. And here you can see they're still embedded in the rock in the process of being removed 50 feet down in this layer. That one was articulated as in life. This one is just washed into place. The 2 bones there near the center that look like they go together, they really don't. They're just washed together, pile of bones. Most of them are replaced with malachite, which shows that this is not a recent burial. It's not just a staining, as some have claimed. Some of them are 100% replaced, though most fossils are not 100%. And not all of these are 100%, but some of them are. There's no collagen. The standard rule is it takes at least 1,000 years for the collagen to disappear. And so we're looking here at one of those turvy fossils. We'll call the other ones topsy. These would be the turvy fossils. Is it possible they fell down a crack? Well, we talked to Dale Fuller, who was the one who was driving the bulldozer when this was initially uncovered, and he showed us exactly where this happened. He said there was no breaks in the rock at all. He didn't see any, and it had been taken down. This is a side view. And this is the area where, back in the 30s, they began mining here, and actually his father drove the bulldozer at this point, and they hit a layer that was so hard it was tearing up the bulldozer, and they had to stop, though it was a profitable copper mine. And then in the 70s, developed better equipment, better techniques, and then came on down to this level in the 70s. And at that point, in the early 70s, is when the first 2 were found. And then in the early 90s, we found a good many more. Looking at a diagram of this cross-section, we see the mining operation of the 30s and the 70s. The road cut was cut in the 30s, so that before the 30s, that all went straight across. And the skeletons were found right here. 50 feet down, and before 1930, this was the profile. When you look at the state of replacement, and there have been a number of radiocarbon dates ranging anywhere from, one says 200, though it was right in the middle of a spring, obviously contaminated, all the way up to 4,000, 1,500. It ranges all over the place, so I think it's obviously contaminated. But obviously, if it's older than just a few hundred years, certainly a few thousand years, then there's serious problems here for the evolutionists. This would not be intrusionally buried 50 feet down in the Dakota Sandstone, especially with intervening layers of extremely hard sandstone. Now again, let's remember the implication according to the evolutionist himself. If you find this kind of thing, evolution would be utterly destroyed. I think we have well verified it. But he won't and can't afford to. In the same context in this book, he goes on to say, ironically, it's also the reason why creationists are so keen on the fake human footprints which were carved during the Depression to fool tourists in the dinosaur beds of Texas. And he's heard about our work all the way from Oxford, but of course he has been sitting behind his desk in Oxford. He's not going to come to Texas and look. But he's sure that they're fake. Now, the interest in the footprints might surprise some, because obviously bones would seem to be better evidence, but not really. Because you can erode the bones and redeposit them. They can fall down cracks. But you can't do that with footprints, can you? Footprints are not going to be intrusionally buried. Can't be. You erode them, they're gone. And so this is really better from that standpoint. It completely eliminates the intrusional burial objection. We've been doing work for the past 20 years in Dinosaur Valley State Park down at Glen Rose. And this is the Paluxy River that runs through that park, where there are just literally thousands of dinosaur tracks. If you like a good place to take a vacation, that's a neat spot. Come down and help us dig up some tracks. These were excavated back in the early 40s by Roland T. Byrd. In addition to these depressed tracks, the four-toed big sauropods and the three-toed tracks, you find some, and many actually, that are slightly raised. Now, what in the world's going on here? Wouldn't a footprint be depressed? Yes, the footprint is depressed, and then other material washes in and fills in that depressed track, and sometimes that infill material then becomes harder rock than the surrounding material that the dinosaur stepped in. And that harder rock is then resistant to erosion, and as it's subsequently exposed and erosion exposes it, it's resistant and then is slightly raised. Now that'll be important when we get further into the presentation. We also find tracks that look like this. Well, this one has to be carved. Why? Well, look at it. It's human. And I think we were somewhat intimidated by that. It's just too good to be true was one explanation. So we looked around for some that weren't quite so good, which we were able to find as well. In the lower right-hand corner, we see a very clear human track. We won't go into detail with this one. We've got much clearer ones. But this was identified by the Dallas Crime Lab as a human footprint. And these were just excavated, maybe a week when this picture was taken, and the dinosaur tracks as well. And we found dozens of these, especially individual tracks. This one was downstream, several hundred yards, but I think you can see the very obvious configuration there. But the real strength, I think, comes in sequence, and these had vague impressions in front and behind, but not really clear. Stan Taylor decided to test this in the early 70s by finding two tracks in the river and seeing if they went back up under the riverbank. He said, let's remove these layers of limestone and clay, about 6 feet of alternating layers, and if they continued back up under the riverbank, what would that say about the idea that they were carved? That'd pretty well rip it, wouldn't it? Well, back up under the riverbank, the trail continued. He found 9 more, and we've since then extended it to 14. And these were very clear. You can see the mud push-up around it and the very obvious human configuration. Well, that caused quite a stir, and several people got very excited. Glenn Kuban, though, came up with an explanation for this. He says, look, we've got some of these duck-shaped tracks that erode to look like the shape on the right, but these elongate tracks erode to wind up like what you see down at the lower right-hand corner, which is kind of human-like. You see, this is just an eroded dinosaur track, and that's the way he explained it. It wouldn't really explain that mud push-up, and the real clear configuration are not likely. And the real problem is when you look at these tracks, you see that raised infill that with erosion doesn't erode to look like a human track. It gets sharper and clearer. And these are extremely clear and getting clearer as the matrix erodes away from it. Looking at a side view, you can see as that matrix erodes away, it's being made more pronounced. And so those duck-shaped tracks, as well as some of the elongate tracks, show this raised center. Plus, notice the cast that was made by Stan Taylor back in the 70s when he uncovered this trail initially. The detail just defies the idea of an eroded. Does this look like an eroded dinosaur track to you? If you had more dark, you could see it a little more clearly. When you put a human foot in it, it just fits perfectly, and that's really the best. You put your foot in it and you feel that molded shape. It's very persuasive. We extended the track further back to the south, and this is the track that really persuaded me. And you have to look at it carefully for a moment. Here is the dinosaur track that's about 25 inches long. But look what stepped in the middle of it. You see all 5 toes and instep and heel just extremely clear right in the middle of it. Now, if it gets any clearer than that, then it has to be carved. If it's not this clear, then it's just erosion. But we've had some say both about this, and so it must be just right. In fact, when I made the first presentation of this one at a national science meeting in Tennessee, Glenn Kuban, who had gotten Humanist of the Year for his explanation of eroded dinosaur tracks, which shows how much the humanists were concerned about this argument, just went berserk. And it was interesting to watch him. And he got on a plane the next morning, which was Sunday morning, and flew to Glen Rose and was in the river that afternoon with a big iron bar. And the owner of the property called me and said, he's out there with an iron bar. And we got out 2 days later, and we could see what had been done to that track. This was just beat to a pulp. Now, we had got stereo photographs. We have casts and molds. It's well documented. But I think he was just documenting how much that bothered him. That one you can still see in a beat-up fashion, but there are a number of others in this sequence that are very impressive. This is several tracks up. This is +6. That was -3. And notice the 3 dinosaur tracks in the anterior portion, but again, something stepped here back toward the heel, a little further back in it. Looking at a side view of that track, you can see to the right the 3 dinosaur tracks that are almost flush. May become pronounced with further erosion. But the depressed portion is extremely human-like, especially when you put a human foot in it. Now, if these are human tracks, we should be able to measure them and see, all right, this is this length, and then this is the same length ahead. And we ought to be able to see a sequence of rights and lefts and rights and lefts, which is not going to be produced by erosion. Now, this one is a right. Directly ahead of it should be, this is the one directly ahead of it, a left. And we can actually see right, left throughout the whole sequence. Now, this is one that's, I think, very clear. This is the way it looked when we first saw it. Just to the upper right-hand corner, you can see something going on up there, but you can't tell. With a little more erosion, the next year we were able to see more clearly, and looking at a side view of that track, and you can see the sandbags in the background. This is at the bottom of the river. You can see the human track with the dinosaur track beside it, not within it, but beside it, and sometimes they're across. There's 134 dinosaur tracks on this platform with a sequence of 14 human tracks going right through the middle. And so sometimes they're within and sometimes across and sometimes beside. But you have here the entire sequence demonstrated of the human tracks and then an obvious trail of brontosaurus tracks going across at about a 30-degree angle. Now that's impressive evidence, not just something, well, that looks like a human foot. Well, you see lots of funny-looking things in rocks, but a right-left sequence. Now you find, when you look in the clouds, you see clouds that maybe look like a bird, or you look at a cliff sometimes and you can see the old man in the mountain. Now, did erosion do that, or was it carved? Well, how would you tell? Well, if you saw 4 old men in the mountain, you'd have a real good idea that wasn't erosion, would you? When you see 14 in a right-left pattern, this is not erosion. Besides that, it's excavated, almost all of them, from under the overburden. We see the analysis like this. All of them, 14 of them, at least have the general human shape. The length is very consistent, more so than the dinosaur tracks, actually, even though some of them are in the process of being revealed. You see individual toes in 7 of the 14, which is exceptional. Mary Leakey's tracks over in Africa, you don't see any individual. Well, you see the great toe in a few of them. Actually, only 1 that I remember, maybe 2. But none of the individual toes. And, of course, I've shown you the most impressive ones. You can distinguish right from left in 12 of the 14. Two of them are just oblong shapes, but in front of it is a right, and behind it is a right. They're consistent from one end to the other. And when Glenn Cluban is lecturing on this, guess which two he shows? You're right. But this is the way you do science. Richard Dawkins can sit behind his desk and say, I know humans and dinosaurs didn't live together, it has to be carved. But you get out and you do the excavation, and you do the analysis, and you do the measurements, and you do a grid, and you analyze this, and when you do, you come up with, I think, excellent evidence. Though the typical response is, well, yeah, that's interesting, but you need more evidence. Now that's just standard. You just say it that way, no matter how much you got, it seems like. We decided to follow this Brontosaurus trail back in the opposite direction, and especially the drought of 2000, we were able to do more. We pumped the river dry and watered the farmers' fields on either side, and with about 3 months' worth of work, exposed a 500-foot consecutive trail. It's the longest consecutive trail on the American continent, second longest in the world. And it's not only the longest, I think it's the best. These tracks are some of the most spectacularly clear tracks in the world. I think maybe the most spectacular. And a creationist did that. Well, when we look at these tracks, the ones going behind the fellow standing there, they're very different. We know what dinosaur tracks look like. We got a whole 156 of them in this trail, and they're clear, and we understand what dinosaur tracks look like. These look different, and they look like human tracks, as we have shown you. Well, that's impressive, but guess what they say next? Well, you need more evidence. So we went ahead of this fella, and you see the platform directly ahead of him. We excavated several layers down, cleaned it off, and sure enough, you see about 100 dinosaur tracks on this platform, and right through the middle of it is another human trail, this time 15 in a right-left sequence. You can see the mud push up around the tracks even from that distance. This was a different individual. This one is about 10 inches. The other one's about 11 and 11 and a half inches. Looking at a close-up of the two tracks in the center of that trail, and each of them would be interesting. We don't have time to do all of that this evening. But you can see the duck-shaped dinosaur tracks here, and they're raised. The one on the left especially dramatically raised, and the one on the right is slightly raised. But look what stepped in the back of the one on the right, with dramatic mud push-up. Not raised, but depressed with mud push-up around it. Looking at a close-up of that one on the right, you see here the raised dinosaur track. That's very typical and just like the one beside it, so you know what it's supposed to look like. But there within it is just an incredibly clear human shape with a dramatic arch, and you actually see the joints in the toes. And you can see that it's in a sequence of 15 in a right-left pattern. Others are not quite that clear, others are very clear, and others not so clear, but that's what you expect when you're making tracks in the mud, maybe not intentionally. And so now we have two trails. Now, you want more evidence? Okay, we got more evidence. And it's interesting to present this on college campuses. We just have lots of fun with it. I think these are the perfect turvy fossils. It's not intrusional like the bones. You can't erode them and redeposit them. They're not carved because they're excavated from under the overburden. It's not erosion. You've got a right-left pattern. How do you explain that? We had Dr. Chuck Finsley come down and look at the tracks. He was wanting one of the dinosaurs that we'd excavated from the area to display. He's curator of the American Museum of Dallas Museum of Natural History in Dallas, and he's recently retired. He was there for 30 years. And he looked at these, and he got rather disturbed, and went home, and then came back, and then went home. And third time down, he said, well, Dr. Patton, I have an explanation for you. I think I can explain these human-looking tracks. He says, I think they were made by aliens. And he was dead serious. And I kind of snickered, and he got mad. And I said, well, Chuck, if they were aliens, I guess they came from a galaxy far, far away, and they're very advanced, more so than we are. And what are they doing walking around barefooted? He didn't like that either. But it kind of reminded me of the Far Side cartoon by Gary Lawson. Here's Professor Farrington and his controversial theory that dinosaurs were actually the discarded chicken bones of giant alien picnickers, which I think is pretty far out. But if you want to draw a cartoon, maybe we should draw it this way. And I think this is a picture of what was going on. These were the fellas that missed the boat. But let's summarize this first section. First, we need to understand the column you see in the textbooks is a conceptual correlation. It's not found anywhere. It's the result of the assumption, correlating. The top C fossils, the things supposed to be down found up, falsify the idea of extinction that you hear parroted all the time. The turvy fossils falsify evolution, that is, the things that are supposed to be at the top that are found down, as we see with the dinosaurs, for example. The Malachite man, you've got 10 individuals found with the dinosaurs 50 feet down in the Dakota Sandstone, and we've got fossil footprints that we've shown you now from the Taylor Trail and the McFall Trail, the two trails there near Dinosaur Valley State Park. Well, there's a lot more evidence, as you'll see, but let's take a break at this point and see if, we'll open it for questions. Why don't we take just a few brief questions and then we'll take a break. Yes?
On your new evidence?
I'm not allowed to speak for them. John's very much aware of this. And he doesn't like people to tell you what he thinks. If you know him, you're aware of that. But how shall I put it? I can tell you that he did give me permission to say he was very impressed by this model. He is in the process of revising his Young Earth book, and he told me that he was going to include these tracks in it just recently. Or was seriously considering it, or words to that effect. He has had some opposition, and it's more a political thing, and he would say that. There was one of the key men there at ICR that's dead set against it. His explanation to me was that I don't care whether they're real or not. This is something that's like a blow to the solar plexus to the evolutionist. And we don't want to make them mad. We just want to impress them with how good work, because as a devout Calvinist, he's convinced that evidence has nothing to do with faith, which I don't think is a scriptural position. We're supposed to be able to give a rational defense for our faith, a reason for the hope that's in us. And it's based on that. But no, it has nothing to do with faith. All you'll do is make them mad. And so he says he doesn't think that ought to be used. And that is not John's position, but that's the position of some there at ICR, and have brought serious pressure to bear on John not to do this, though I think it's a battle at this point. You just need to think for yourself. Sometimes people are in positions where they can't say all they want to say. And I'll just leave it at that. Yes?
Have you guys done any studies on the distance between the human footprints to see how fast that guy was running?
Yes. It varies. The average is 26 inches, and I can walk in those steps easily. Now, at 11.5 inches, if his proportions are average, then he's 6'4". Of course, lots of short people got big feet, so we don't know for sure. But I'm right at 6 feet, and I can walk in them without a whole lot of trouble. You do see that it starts out at the lower end in a fairly normal pace, and then it stops. And that real clear first track that I said persuaded me that was destroyed, that's a standing track. You get the little dots at the end with the hourglass shape, that's a standing track. And the next one overlaps. There's no distance in between. This one is overlapping. But from that point on, they get further and further and further apart. But the average is 26 inches. Okay. Good question. All right, why don't we take a break, and then we've got a lot more exciting stuff to show you. Back to the record of the rocks. We talked about the Malachite man and then the fossil footprints there at Glen Rose. Also at Glen Rose, not in these two trails, is this Burdick tract that we saw earlier. After the confidence that we gained, I believe, from understanding the Taylor Trail. And by the way, when those markings began to be seen, I mean, here was what Taylor saw when he first excavated, and then as further erosion took place, more things began to be seen that weren't seen and weren't visible. We didn't see all the dinosaur tracks initially. Just the human tracks showed up to begin with. And then the dinosaur tracks began showing up. And we didn't understand that. And I backed away as well until we got down and were able to find out what was going on. And yes, we were right both times. Dinosaur tracks and human tracks. The dinosaur tracks, especially the upper part of the trail, are slightly raised. The human tracks are depressed. And so you can tell the obvious difference. But with the confidence we gained there, we went back to look at the Burdick track. Is there a way to tell whether this is carved or not? Well, sometimes you find interior structure in a fossil. Sometimes you don't. You have to just get lucky. But we decided to section. As you can see here, this has been sawed across. The greater displacement would be at the heel. And here is the cross-section at the heel. And can you see the disturbed material directly under the heel? Now, carving would cut across the contours, but if the contours follow, then obviously you're looking at a real fossil. I presented this at one of the science meetings there in Dallas, and it got kind of quiet. And then finally one of the fellows stood up and said, well, obviously this is a real track, but it must be a dinosaur track that somebody carved toes on. Just completely ad hoc. But I'm glad that he did that, because then we proceeded to test, which is the way science works, and saw it across the toes. Now this is a real reach, because sometimes we section dinosaur tracks and find nothing. Some of you just have to get lucky. This is very fine-grained limestone and records pretty well. And sure enough, looking at a cross-section here, photographed under black light to make the structure show up and then color corrected, you can see the big toe is there, and you can actually see structures under each of the toes. If you're an engineer, you can see the load-bearing structures. We won't take time to give you that lecture, but it's extremely obvious to an engineer, especially at the great toe, where there'd be the greatest displacement. You see the following contours. And so both heel and toe then have been verified on this track that was just too good to be true. But now then, all of a sudden they're just grasping at straws. They say, well, now wait a minute, it's not too good, because you see the front is broader than the heel. That's kind of distorted, and the toes are spread out. And look, it's raised in the center, and tracks are not supposed to be raised in the center. And we didn't know a whole lot about tracks, but what do you do when you don't know? You get out and you learn. And so we decided to make some tracks. And we got some of these junior high students here to make standing tracks and walking tracks and running tracks, and we find out that they're all different and can be recognized. But this little girl was running in two directions here, and we see three tracks going away and two tracks coming toward us. Looking at the two at the end, here's one coming toward, one going away. A running track spreads out the toes because you push off with the front of your foot, and it spreads it out. And so it's broader than the heel. And you rock over the center, which leaves a raised center. Now, we didn't know that. We learned that when you get out and you do the science. The burdick track is a running track with the pronated toes, and you see the raised center. It's really, our tracks weren't as good as the burdick. It's finer grained. And so I think all of those answers, all of those objections were answered. There's also a large cat track that was found in the area, actually 7 of them. This is the clearest. Well, a large mammal skull is what Dawkins said you'd need to find with the dinosaurs. Well, I think a large mammal foot would have the same implication. And so they have to be carved. Well, we sectioned across the pads here, and you can see that cross-section, again photographed under black light. And notice the following contours. Is this one carved? Now, this one likewise, that large mammal foot in this instance obviously isn't. There are other interesting tracks in other places. Antelope Springs, Utah, here displays this track. It's a cast and a mold. One fits in the other. Looks like more a shoe or a sandal print. The interesting thing is this is in the Cambrian, and embedded in the heel is a trilobite, which is typical of that Cambrian area, and you can see that rolled almost like a roly-poly on the right side there, and then the concave section on the left that fits over. Now, this is, as we suggested, at the very bottom of the column. Now, normally you don't find human tracks on the bottom of the ocean, which is the kind of environment reflected here. We wouldn't expect to, and normally you don't. But if you ever do once, you know they're not millions of years apart. Interestingly, Reader's Digest made reference to this and says the rock fell open like a book, revealing on one side the footprint itself, the other half the slab showed an almost perfect mold, and the footprint and the fossil, which they're referring to here, a close-up here of that trilobite in the heel. If the print is what it appears to be, it would be sufficient to overturn all conventionally accepted ideas of human and geological evolution. Well, yes, that's if it's what it appears to be. It is now at the Creation Evidence Museum in Glen Rose. Interestingly, right along the side, some have pointed out maybe indications of stitching. It's possible. I'm not going to affirm that, but it would certainly be consistent with it and kind of looks like it. This is obviously another turvy fossil. We've got several places in Texas where we see these kinds of tracks. This picture doesn't show them that well, but they're pointing to 3 in a right-left sequence. This is the clearest, and this is near Sonora, Texas, down in the southern part. And there are at least 5 clear tracks there that were actually I photographed earlier this year. And then in Stinnett, Texas, which is the opposite, right at the top of Texas, top of the Panhandle, they've had a slab with human footprints in it for the past 30 years on display at the Hutchinson County county seat there of Stinnett County. Very clear track with a child's track beside it, and there's 7 that were found. We have another excavation plan to find some more. And some say, well, maybe this was carved, but this has a unique answer to that. Notice the thin, broken layer that you can see that is very thin and much thinner than the depth of the track. Looking at a side view, you can see that it's much thinner. The track goes down deeper so that if this were carved, it would penetrate that thin layer. And so obviously this isn't carved. That's original impression in the sediment. Excellent evidence. Then in New Mexico, we have this track in the Permian. This is supposed to be 100 million years older than the tracks at Glen Rose, just as clear as it can be. Now, this is a standing track, not a running track. And it's extremely shallow. It's almost impossible to photograph. You have to get the light at the right angle, and it has to be wet, and then it shows up. But it's very, very clear. But this is more like what you would see when you got a wet foot on a tile floor walking along, hourglass shape with the dots at the end. Obvious topsy or turvy fossil. In Turkmenistan, there's a plain with all kinds of dinosaurs. This is where the longest consecutive dinosaur track in the world is, the only one longer than the one that we've uncovered. In Pravda, they made this report. The Turkmenian Plateau contains more than 3,000 footprints, but the most mysterious fact is that among the footprints of dinosaurs, footprints of bare human feet were found. We've not been able to get there. I had my visa. We had the fellow who was actually head of the geology department at the University of Turkmenistan had agreed to take us to the site. Paid $1,200 for a visa, and here we go. And now then the government finds out and runs him out of the country because he was going to show us this evidence. He made 3 expeditions to investigate, and in the book Science in the USSR says if we speak about human footprints, it's made by an animal, human-like animal. Incredibly, the footprint is on the same plateau where there are dinosaur tracks. If we speak about the human footprints, well, he says there are 3 trails of human tracks going through the middle, and Pravda reported it that way. We need good pictures, but interesting bit of evidence there. At Glen Rose, we have found this fossil. This is from about 5 miles downstream from where the dinosaur tracks are. That looks amazingly like a human finger, but you find lots of funny-looking rocks that look like things. Is there any way to distinguish? Well, the first thing they say is, well, most fossils are mashed flat, and they're not three-dimensional. Yes, but not so at Glen Rose. For example, about 100 yards from the museum, I found this, and there are hundreds of them there, fossil of a worm, earthworm. Now, if anything's going to be mashed flat, it would be a worm, wouldn't it? But it's still fat and juicy, and it's typical of what you see there at Glen Rose. We sectioned across this at an angle to show more information. Again, a reach. Sometimes you've got interior structure, sometimes you don't. But if you do, then you've got pretty good evidence. And sure enough, at that angle, you can see the bone in the interior. In fact, we've been able to trace ligaments from one end to the other. Dr. Dale Peterson of Oklahoma City, in fact, the last lecture I heard him give on this was an hour and a half, and you don't want to know all that about this. But he's traced the ligaments from one end to the other, and with the x-ray here, you can see the interior structure and the obvious shape. Down further south in Texas, about 100 miles south from Glen Rose, near London, Texas, is this rather picturesque scene where back about 1940, a fellow was fishing, saw a strange-looking rock, broke it open, and here's a hammer in it. This is the same geologic horizon that we have at Glen Rose. This is the lower Cretaceous. But the whole area is composed of the Cretaceous concretions, which is supposed to be 140 million years old. Obviously a turby fossil. Up in Oklahoma, we found this iron pot that was embedded in the coal, supposed to be 295 million years ago. Here's the affidavit of the fellow who was working for the utilities company, broke it open with a big sledgehammer, and here's the cast and the mold on either side, and the pot falls out. This is his description of it. That's obviously a turby fossil. In Utah, near Blanding, Utah, Dinosaur Natural Bridges National Monument, we have these beautiful arches, and under them, the Anasazi Indians drew petroglyphs. And here we see Dr. Swift pointing towards some of the petroglyphs. Just above my head, you see the Anasazi warrior, and you see the snakes. But we almost have enough dark to see the Brontosaurus. That is very clearly there. Now, it's covered with desert varnish. Let me back up again here. And so it's very difficult to photograph, but there is the shape that is unmistakable, that you can see. Once it's been pointed to, you can still see it pretty clearly. A turvy fossil. In Colorado, we have this made by the Fremont Indians, who were contemporary with the Anasazi, that looks like the Triceratops, the three horns, the frill down the back of the neck. It looks more like a triceratops than some of the people there, supposedly represented by the Fremont Indians. Obviously a turvy fossil again. This one's from the Grand Canyon, again with a heavy desert varnish over it, which is an indication of antiquity. Somebody shot him in the tail, and you can see what happens if you tried to mess with it today. If you tried to do any carving, it would really show up, breaking through that desert varnish. Another turvy fossil. Okay, let's travel down to South America and see other evidence that tests the column and shows these turvy fossils, which are the test, which is the use that we make of the column. Dr. Javier Cabrera passed away just a few years ago in December of the year 2000. We'd made several trips down there talking with him, and is a very interesting character. He was 20 years head of the Department of Medicine at the University of Lima. His father had begun collecting burial stones from the Inca tombs back in the 30s, and he continued collecting them. He now has had over 11,000 at the time of his death. He lives in a 300-year-old castle right there on the town square. His great-grandfather established the town, descendant of the conquistadors, and they live in this castle, and he's made part of it into a museum that displays these stones. About a third of them display some of the most disgusting pornography you could ever imagine, I hope. I won't show you those, but about a third of them show dinosaurs. We were able to get into the tombs, and we participated in excavations. If you see the video on this evidence, we've got an hour of this kind of evidence. We just got back from Peru about a week ago, and brought back a big 70-pound stone. I'll show you in a moment. But you can see here in situ the stones in tombs, and they're still being dug up. This one is in Dr. Cabrera's office. It's about 2 feet tall, and a close-up so that you can see what it looks like. Interesting thing here is that you see the dermal frills on the back, these stair-step looking frills that weren't preserved in most of the fossils. When Mr. Sinclair made his sign depicting this kind of dinosaur, he didn't put the frills on the back, did he? We didn't know about it. They were first published in Geology in '91 and represented just like this, which is a stone from a tomb probably about 500 AD from the Nazca culture, actually pre-Inca. This is a large, huge stone in Dr. Cabrera's museum with a very obvious brontosaurus type with the frills on the back. You can see the close-up here along with other features there on the dinosaur. Looking at the top, you can see another dinosaur, this time with a man in his mouth, a foot. Very artistically done. Some are rather crude, obviously a wide variety of artists, but just hundreds of these. Many of them show the man and dinosaur in conflict. Some of them maybe domesticated and somewhat stylized, rather artsy. Others more literal, but very obvious what type of dinosaur we're talking about. Very specific types are seen. Now some have said, well, but Dr. Cabrera is a strange fellow, and I'll acknowledge that, though he's obviously a very famous and very intelligent man. But you have a number of other places that display these types of stones that are just the opposite of what many say. Some of the archaeologists say, well, nobody knows anything about carved stones. This is just made up by Cabrera. And they're found all over Peru and displayed in national museums. This is the Aeronautical Museum in Lima. They have about 35 of the stones displayed, and at least 4 of them have dinosaurs on them. I was just there, and I had some beautiful photographs in the camera that was stolen, along with my computer, and I'll have to go back. But these were enough. This is another dinosaur on one of the stones there in the Aeronautical Museum. This is one of the, and we also saw them in the museum in Nazca, And I had great photographs, which I'm going to have to go back to get. This one I brought back with me. It's a 70-pound stone. It has 3 dinosaurs on it and is of a slightly different style, found about 100 miles away from where the others were. This is on the Paracas Peninsula, about 100 miles from Nazca. And these are embossed, slightly raised from a bas-relief, whereas most of the ones in Dr. Cabrera's museum are incised. And you can see blood spots or body fluids from the mummy that was in the tomb with it, which is really intriguing. I think we're going to be able to date this. It's been a challenge to date well, you don't date the rock because that's not what's interesting. It's the carving on the rock that's interesting. How do you do that? Well, maybe this will allow us to do that. It was excavated in early 2006, this year. And these stones are continuing to be excavated. This is another stone that was excavated in 2005. Of course, Cabrera died in 2000. And you see a close-up there where this is slightly incised or embossed, and the close-up of the eye shows the saltpeter development growth in the grooves and the very obvious patina, which all indicate age. Also, in the tombs, you can see burial cloths and pottery, and they will display often the dinosaur motif. Now, it's kind of hard to do it precisely as you're weaving, but they did a pretty good job of depicting the dinosaur with their woven designs. The Moshi made beautiful vases. They're famous for this, and it's just impossible to reproduce. But look what they put on their vases. And this is about 2,000 to 2,500 years ago. These people were seeing dinosaurs. This is in the National Museum in Lima. Up in the northern part of Peru, they're gold death masks. But look what's on either side of the face. Here again, those dermal frills on his back and the long tail curling over his back and the huge teeth. We're seeing dinosaurs. These are the evidences from Peru that normally takes me an hour to tell about, but you've got about 5 minutes worth of it. Turvy fossils. Now, let's go to Mexico. This is another hour lecture, but we'll look quickly. In Guanajuato, down in Acámbaro, we heard about a discovery that is made by Jules Rudd back in the early part of the 1900s. It's difficult to skip over all of that. He uncovered or had in his collection some 33,000 ceramic figurines. And we had to go down there quite a few times in order to get all the evidence and learn and get permission and so forth. But we were able to see these, and about 10% of the 33,000 of the ceramic figurines are of dinosaurs. Some of the Brontosaurus type were standing up. We learned that about 15 years ago in Bacher's book, Dinosaur Heresies, maybe 20 years ago now. But you look at what they were depicting probably 2,500 years ago, according to the thermoluminescent dating that was done, is just like what Bacher is telling us. And of course, Spielberg convinced us they all stood up with his movie. But again, a wide variety. I have over 20,000 digital images of this collection, and you don't want to see them all. About 2,600 dinosaurs. And I'm sure there are more than that, but I was trying to be conservative. But is any question about what we're looking at there? It's, I think, very obvious. They now have them on display. When we arrived there, they had them hidden in the back of the police department. They were ashamed. This will embarrass us. And it took an act of Congress to get them out. And now then, they're in a museum, publicly displayed and very well displayed, and they tell the whole story. Now, the international, the National Museum and the Institute of Archaeology just has fits about this, but they know the facts. They've got them documented, and so you can come see them. This is my wife's favorite. But I think the conclusion is obvious here, that man and dinosaurs lived together. And we see evidence of this all over the world. We, earlier this year, traveled to Cambodia. I had been sent a very intriguing picture on the internet from a tour guide from this area where they had uncovered a temple and had investigated a certain section that showed some interesting carvings on the temple. But in the northern part of Cambodia, over next to Vietnam, Thailand, we see some beautiful, spectacular temples. These are actually the largest and probably the most spectacular ever built. The major builder was Jayavarman VII, the most famous. He began to rule in 1181, and his picture is seen here in Phnom Penh in the National Museum. I took this picture earlier this year. And he's the one that built most of these, and particularly built to Prom. You may see some scenes here that look familiar. This was a Buddhist monastery dedicated in 1186, but Lara Croft took some of the scenes from this area. You may have seen that one. And it's beautiful. Just almost every square inch of this temple is covered by carvings. But in this section, there at the western gate, as you come in, there's a corner formed by the intersection of the outer wall and that front gate, right there, where you see a stone column with animals represented in circles all the way up that column. It's two corners right in the corner showing dancing girls on one side, animals on the other. And here's what's in the center of that 10-foot column. Into Prom that was dedicated over 820 years ago. They were seeing dinosaurs and depicted them very, very accurately. This is just, I think, more proof of the co-occurrence of humans and dinosaurs. Now, let's move to the significance of this. Notice a statement by Louis Jacobs of SMU. He's very much an anti-creationist, president of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, and he's commenting on some things he's heard, though I don't think he's really seen the evidence, in his book Quest for the African Dinosaur, and refers to this claim of the co-occurrence of men and dinosaurs. Such an association would dispel an Earth with vast antiquity. The entire history of creation, including the day of rest, could be accommodated in the 7 biblical days of the Genesis myth. Evolution would be vanquished. Now, this is his assessment, and I think he's absolutely right. If you demonstrate the co-occurrence, this is what it means, and the evolutionist understands that. Now, I don't know why we're afraid to jump on this kind of evidence, because they have said, all right, this is what you need to show us. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to be honest enough to accept it, but there are an awful lot of people that will and do. Looking back at the statement we referred to earlier by Stephen Stanley of Johns Hopkins, he says in the beginning of that quote, there's an infinite variety of ways in which since 1859, when The Origin of Species was published, the general concept of evolution might have been demolished. Now, that's his term. Consider the fossil record, a little-known resource in Darwin's day. The unequivocal discovery of a fossil population of horses in Precambrian rocks would disprove evolution. More generally, any topsy-turvy sequence of fossils would force us to rethink our theory, yet not a single one has come to light. And of course, won't, as long as he won't come look. We've invited him down. He refuses. We did have a professor from University of Houston come down, got within about 50 yards of the tracks there at the Paluxy and looked out and said, I don't see any tracks, and turned around and left. And then we said, Dr. Safersman, come on down, we'll show you. Now, I've been here, I didn't see any human tracks, and he left. And so he tells his students he was there, and he didn't see any. And Stephen Stanley's been invited. Not a single one has come to light, and won't as long as he doesn't look. As Darwin recognized, a single geographic inconsistency would have nearly the same power of destruction. Now again, these are the terms that they're using. Just one, he says, would be enough to rip it, because you could not. Well, if it's down, it's supposed to be up. That's the real test. And we've shown all kinds of inconsistencies in the geologic column. From the Malachite man, the fossil footprints from 3 places in Texas, New Mexico, Turkmenistan, dinosaur petroglyphs from Mexico and Peru and Cambodia. If you're really honest, I mean, how much would more make any difference? There's just a big pile of it, and according to the evolutionists themselves, this would demolish. This would have the same power of destruction. This is their analysis. This would disprove evolution. Or as Jacob says, it would be vanquished. Well, I agree with all of them. I think, and you'll just have to decide for yourself, have we demonstrated the co-occurrence? If we have, that is the implication. We want to conclude with the statement made by NOVA, who sent people down there. They had 2 weeks of investigation and filming. The people there were excited. They felt like they had really earth-shaking evidence, and went back, and the editor killed it. They did do a short blurb called God, Darwin and the Dinosaurs, in which they said there is nothing at Glen Rose that looks anything like a human footprint. Now, that's exactly what they said. But then went on to discuss it, and I think we can understand why. Referring to dinosaur footprints side by side with humans, which was plain, they deny. Finding them would counter evidence that humans evolved long after the dinosaurs became extinct, and back up the claim that all species, including man, were created at one time. They said this is what it would mean, and we're not going to do that. And I think I know why. It's not science. It's about philosophy. It's about religion. And it's just bad science in order to defend their religion. But that's the implication. And they're right. That's exactly what that means. And if you think that we've proved our case, then that's the implication of it. All right. Let's see if some of you have some questions. Yes, sir.
It seems like you're inviting a lot of universities, and you don't seem to make friends there. Why is it that they invite you?
Well, usually they don't, but the creation clubs on campus have the right to use the auditorium, and they usually have to go through a lot of excuses and book it 6 months ahead, but they can, and there I am, and there's not anything they can do about it. Though sometimes I'm invited. At Texas A&M, I mentioned earlier, I was invited by the physics department, and we addressed the professors and the grad students. And when it was finished, it was about a 40-minute presentation of what you've seen tonight. So most of what you've seen summarized. The head of the department got up and he said, "Well, Dr. Patton, I find that absolutely compelling and unanswerable. And I just have to accept that." And he turned around and sat down. And we had lots of questions, but not one negative note sounded that day. So it's not always negative. That was just it shocked the daylights out of me, because I was used to more, aliens or, somebody carved toes on it or something. Falling down cracks or back in caves and all kind of ad hoc explanations. I was talking to one professor, actually made a presentation at a university in Tennessee, State University in Tennessee, to a group of senior geology students, and they all turned around to the head of the department when it was over and to see what he was going to say. And he said, "Well, we don't know that there weren't dinosaurs back there that had human feet." And I thought a minute, and I said, "Well, I guess that's right. We don't know that. We also don't know that there weren't humans back there with dinosaur feet. Wouldn't that make about as much sense?" Wouldn't it be more reasonable to say these things that look like dinosaur feet were made by dinosaurs and these things look like human feet were made by humans? No, he wouldn't agree with that. I said, well, if they were human tracks, would they look any different? And he just got up and left. That was the end of it. And about half of them became creationists that afternoon. We get very encouraging results. I was at the University of Arkansas about a year ago, and there were 3 geologists who attended. The professors would not attend. These work for the state of Arkansas, and so we're not in academia and probably a little freer. They were very antagonistic the first night in their questions. The second night, you could tell it had toned down some and there was more information type questions. The third night, they heard the lecture you've heard tonight, and there were no questions. The fourth night, they were there, but the one who had sort of been the leader came up to me after it was over, and he said, we 3 geologists have been here each night, and I'll have to say we're impressed. In fact, we're just convinced that evolution cannot be true, and we've just got to start over. Now, what should we read? So we had some books for him to read. This, sometimes they're ready to tar and feather you, and of course that happened in the Lord's day too. And some of them won't believe if they got somebody raised from the dead, but there are honest people out there, and we ought not to be so conceited to think we're the only ones that are. And some of them have only heard one side, and they only see one view, and it looks pretty impressive until they see the alternative view and a consistent presentation. And that's all it takes. I had a geologist who had graduated with a PhD from the University of Alaska call me. This was about 2 weeks ago. And he said, my pastor made me look at your videos. And he said, and I'll just quote directly, he said, it changed my life. And he said, I want to order 3 more sets. He said, I'm going to change some more lives. So don't think people won't be affected. A lot of them won't, but a lot of them will. And we're looking for the honest hearts. Other questions? Yes?
Many years ago, I read Dr. Morris's book, The Genesis Flood, and in there was the verdict track, and many people here know about that. And they discussed it in National Geographic in, I think, 1939 or 1940. So I went down to the Denver Library and checked it out and made a copy of the article. And I forget the guy's name who was down there, you mentioned it, but he said in that article that if these are truly human tracks and the whole science of historical geology is wrong, and the geologist might as well take a truck driving, because he realized the significance of it.
No. I'm not sure I'd want him on the road either. Go ahead.
I coined a phrase from the O.J. Simpson trial, but it applies to the evolutionists. If it doesn't fit, you must omit.
Yeah.
And that's what they do, is they omit anything that doesn't fit their agency values.
We've had a number of occasions where we've seen deliberate destruction of evidence at probably half a dozen times. Yes.
Patton, did you read the story of Martin Lockley's recent footprint find down in Mexico? Do you have any opinion of that? Or they said it was only 10,000 years old, of course.
Yes. I'm anxious to get down there to see it. I probably will be able to later this year. Until I've seen it, I wouldn't comment. But I'm not sure. It's very intriguing. They thought it was much older until they saw what it was. It's amazing how that clarifies the picture for them. Yes.
You showed those pictures, I guess, from the Incas, which implied strongly that they had live dinosaur sightings maybe a couple of thousand years ago, which would have been a couple of thousand years after the flood. Do you have any thoughts about why they might have had live dinosaur sightings 2,000 years after the flood, but 2,000 2,000 years after that, we don't see any at all?
Well, there's some pretty interesting accounts from the Congo and Papua New Guinea, and not that we can say have been confirmed, but there's some interesting evidence. Maybe they're not all gone yet. The environmentalists tell us we're losing about a species a month, which I think is probably overblown, but I don't see new ones popping in every month, but looks like a downhill process they're talking about. It is going downhill, and things are becoming extinct, and we know of dozens of examples of real things that have become extinct. This would be another example. If they were living around Denver, I suspect we'd want to shoot them. If you saw Jurassic Park, you'd understand why you certainly wouldn't want them around where you were. We read about dragon slayers, and they were famous for killing these things. They wanted to get rid of them. Maybe that had something to do with it. Some have really struggled with the idea that things like Seismosaurus would have to pump blood 80 feet in the air. That'd be a real challenge. Some hypothesize that maybe he had 8 hearts in order to get it up there. But of course, if there was twice the atmospheric pressure, it'd be like the bottom of a swimming pool. Things are easy to lift. It would work. Now, after the flood, with that collapse, if that's part of the model, some have departed from that. I don't think it's been abandoned completely, but it would fit here and maybe explain why the dinosaurs didn't do as well. Plus, the world is not as lush and productive. We now have deserts and really high oceans and ice caps that I don't think we had before the flood. We don't have rainforest everywhere. So it's not that well suited for them. So things have gone downhill, and at best it's a deterioration rather than evolution. Now people say, well, look, they had dinosaurs and now then we don't. That's evolution. What? We lost them. They went downhill. People have a hard time grasping it. It was change, and that translates into evolution. I was testifying at the State Textbook Committee in Texas with Dr. Bishop, who's head of the Department of Biology there at the University of Texas, and they were asking us questions, and they asked Dr. Bishop, what's the best example of evolution that you could see? And he said, well, the Texas salamander is an excellent example. Said it lives in caves, and it's adapted to its environment down there where there's no light and it doesn't have eyes, and you see this adaptation. And so they said, Dr. Patton, what do you have to say about that? And I said, well, there's a tremendous amount of genetic information to make an eye. It's just an incredible mechanism with all kinds of information involved, and this critter lost it. Now that's not evolution, that's devolving. Now, he really didn't, but it looks like he lost it. It comes back when he gets out in light. I think that's design, but anyway, at best he lost it. I said, now if he comes up with a headlight down there, that'll be evolution. Which is the way the audience responded, by the way. Dr. Bishop got mad and he got up and left. One more question came to him. He said, well, Dr. Bishop, can you come up with a better example than that salamander that went blind? And he just left. He just got up and marched out. We have fun. My wife thinks I have too much fun sometimes. But I think it needs to be exposed. And other questions? Yes.
You mentioned, what was it, Dinosaurs or something, supposedly having 8 hearts or something?
The Seismosaurus.
Yeah, well, don't we as humans have little valves that keep the blood from backflowing? So with that take care of the problem even 8
well, no, it has to pump at 80 feet in the air. That's backflowing is not.
Little valves that close to keep,
Yeah.
like foot valves.
Yeah.
That pump it.
It's an amazing, it's an astounding hydraulic system, and that's an understatement. If you ever heard M.E. Clark lecture on the hydraulics of the human heart, you'd be amazed at that. But I don't think it would help it go up 80 feet.
We have a program on the radio that talks about just studying the giraffe, talking about
Just the pressure. Yeah. Yeah. The pressure necessary just to get it up, 18 feet per giraffe, let alone 80 feet, would be enough pressure to really do some damage without those valves. Yeah. Amazing design. Yes.
On the New Mexico fossils, so I think it was July 92, I might be off a month, but in the Smithsonian Magazine, an article about the gentleman who is a fossil hunter, and he has a big shed with all kinds of trackways in it. And within that, there were 3-toed tracks, and they would disappear and then come again on I think it was mudstone or sandstone. And then in the magazine itself, there is a bear print, just as clear as can be. And of course, they just said, well, some hitherto unknown species make that bear-like track. And it's just incredible how, at least it was printed in Smithsonian, which I give them credit.
They referred to some of the tracks as problematic.
Yes, that was the word.
Now, that spurred my interest. And so I've talked to him. It's an interesting story. Which we won't take time to tell it, but the problematic, in fact, the title, the heading over it, Problematica, and then he discussed that. And it wasn't just the bear track. And talking to him, he acknowledged that there were human tracks in those sequences, and so I began to investigate, and that's where we found that New Mexico track. Yeah, that's in the Robleithos Mountains that Jerry Parker, found.
He has an old Jeep with a Permian license plate on it.
Yes, yes. That's the Permian sediment. This is about 8,000 feet up in the mountains, the Robleithos Mountains, and he's the one that found those tracks, and that's the reason we found that one. Now, by the way, we about less than a quarter mile from that site, there are 4 in a right-left sequence that I've seen a picture of. The owner showed that to us, and we were going there next, but then the owner of the property next door that thought this was his property showed up with a shotgun and ran us off. And we actually had a mining permit that had permission to take some of the tracks out. But he had a shotgun. And that trumped it. And we haven't been able to get back. You have to go through 5 ranches in order to get to it up in the mountains. We're making progress, though. Yes.
Every year I go trout fishing on the North Platte and just west of Casper, Wyoming at Alcova Reservoir. And I found a bear print in Cretaceous rock. I think it's Dakota. Would that be your interest?
A large mammal track would utterly destroy evolution, as according to Richard Dawkins. Yes, that would do the trick. We need to get it documented. Yeah, get us some pictures, sir. Maybe we can get it. I'm up there from time to time.
The owner has not even been able to get some. There's a dinosaur museum in Casper.
Yeah,
He's not
I've been there.
able to get anybody out to even look at it.
Well, they don't want to see it. I was talking there at the Price Museum in Utah about some of these petroglyphs to the curator, and we showed him the pictures that we had just taken. And he acknowledged, well, yes, I've seen several of those. And I said, well, how did the Indians draw pictures of them if they've been gone 65 million years? And he said, well, maybe they were smoking some of that Paiute stuff and dreamed it up. A 65 million year old dream, I guess. Talk about a reach. Carl Sagan, in his book Demon-Haunted Dreams, Ridiculing the Creationist, talks about dragons in all societies and that they look like dinosaurs. He's honest enough to admit, well, that's what they look like. And it's not just China. Virtually every society, from Eskimos to South Sea Islanders and Australia, you have dragons. And well, he says the explanation is obviously men didn't live back there, but the shrews did. These were little small mammals that lived with the dinosaurs, and we've inherited the memory of these 65 million year old shrews. That's in the book by Carl Sagan. I'd love to inherit my father's memory, but a 65 million year old shrew is a bit of a reach, I think. Yeah.
This would be with Patton was just a comment I ran into a guy on our job site a couple of months ago who was raised in northern Arizona, and his dad and were playing artifacts and stuff, and he saw the drawings, and he said it was clearly looked like a woolly mammal being killed by Indians.
Oh, yeah.
So he was talking to his Navajo friends about it, and he says, "Man, I didn't know you guys have been around here for hundreds of thousands of years," and he kind of smiled and he said, "My great-grandfather drew that, and he killed the last woolly mammal in this region, and, you know, if you want, I can
Yeah.
get him up with you and stuff."
That would be very interesting. It'd be nice to get him on video saying that. Yeah. We thank you very much for the invitation to be with you tonight. As you can probably tell, I enjoy talking about it and doing battle sometimes. We hope you find it interesting. If you'd like to know more, order the videos. We can get those to you quickly. And thank you very much. It's obvious that it was catastrophic and that stratigraphy indicates a flood deposit and challenges naturalism. Now, we won't have time this evening to look at all of the evidence for flood deposits, but we're going to look particularly at the evidence of coexistence of humans and dinosaurs, which I think is central and critical, and even evolutionists would acknowledge it. But the evolutionary representation of what you find when you dig down in this sedimentary rock record looks like this, the geologic time scale. And down at the bottom you have the very simple animals, and you get more complex as you go up. This is that progression of life supposed to be recorded over millions of years. The biggest problem with this is that it's found only in the textbooks. You can't dig down in the earth and find this complete record anywhere, as any knowledgeable geologist knows, though often you have to get to grad school to understand that. But notice the statement by Leighton Judson, a standard geology text, that says, because we cannot find sedimentary rocks representing all Earth time neatly in one convenient area, we must piece together the rock sequence from locality to locality. It is not found anywhere. It's pieced together. Some over here in Texas, and some over in China, and some in England. This process of tying one rock sequence in one place to another in some other place is known as correlation. And so it's correlated from various places and not found in any one spot. As the Encyclopedia Britannica says, the end product of correlation is a mental abstraction called the geologic column. Now, many students taking earth science, junior high, high school, even college courses don't grasp this, that it's a mental abstraction, it's a construct. Notice the comment about this by R.H. Rastel, again in the Encyclopedia Britannica from Cambridge. He says, it cannot be denied that geologists are here arguing in a circle, and he's explaining how they come up with this correlation. How do they know what goes on top and what goes on bottom? Because they're picking it from various places. It's not because of where it's found geographically. He says the succession of organisms has been determined by a study of the remains embedded in the rocks, and the relative ages of the rocks are determined by the organisms they contain. Now, we can see that circular process, or illustrate it somewhat oversimplified, but it works like this. A person says, I have a primitive fossil here. Well, how do you know that's a primitive fossil? Well, it's found in an old rock. All right, I understand that. But how do you know that this is an old rock? Well, it's got a primitive fossil in it. And we're obviously not proving anything, but this is the correlation process and the way it works. Notice Putman and Bassett's description of this in the textbook Geology, and these are standard geology textbooks used across the country. A rock that had an early form, and notice the assumption, this presumes the thing to be proved to start with, but it's an early form, so where does it go? It goes on the bottom, doesn't it? Clearly older than rocks containing later forms, which would go on the top. Furthermore, I gave this presentation about 2 months ago at Texas A&M Commerce to the physics department. I won't tell you what the result was until the end, but you can, actually it was very positive, I'll give you that clue. But I'll tell you about that when we finish, and you can be thinking about how physicists would respond to this kind of evidence. There were about 30 professors and about 20 grad students, and actually it was a slightly abbreviated version of this presentation. And I'm on college campuses about once a month across the country, and we were just up at the University of Akron, and we were speaking there each evening for a week. We had a nasty letter published in the newspaper about midway through the week, and it doubled our crowds. Well, we had this all set and ready to go. All right, here we go, getting close. All right, we're going to be talking about the record of the rocks this evening. And the main theme, as indicated, is going to be the coexistence of humans and dinosaurs. The evolutionists tell us that when we dig down in the rocks, we see the progressive development of life recorded as if recorded by a tape recorder over long periods of time. Over 500 million years, the record that is indicated in the fossil record. And so we're talking primarily about that record, the sedimentary rock record that covers the continents. There's an average of about 1.5 miles of sedimentary rock that covers the continents. It has billions and billions of dead things in it. It's laid down by water, and it covers all the continents. Now, I know a good explanation for that. But there are alternative views that we'll be considering this evening. Is this 1.5 miles of sediment on the average that covers all the continents the result of gradual buildup over millions of years that records the development of life over that period? Or is this a rapid, catastrophic deposition that is a flood deposit? Now, those are two very different views, and we should be able to look at the rock record and tell the difference. Of course, if you believe philosophically in naturalism and you don't want to submit to a creator, then you have to have a slow, gradual explanation for the record of the rocks. I think when you look at the record of the rocks, Agostino's axioms provide the ultimate basis for practically all interpretation of Earth history, so their importance can hardly be overemphasized. What they don't tell you is that he thought the whole deposit, 1.5 miles in the average, covering the continents, was done in a year-long series of catastrophes produced by the flood. Here is a picture of his book. When I was doing work at Cambridge in England, they had one of the original editions of his book under glass in the Oxford Library, not in the Oxford, in the Trinity Library. The flypiece dedication page says, dedicated to the proof of the Noachian deluge. Now that's where he was coming from, which they don't tell you. One of the things people say when you mention the idea of, well, maybe a flood did this is, well, that's crazy. There's no way a flood would explain what we see in the geologic record. You've got all these separate layers and different groups and segregated groups of animals, and a flood would just make a big mishmash. Of course, they don't know much about floods, which they reveal in such statements, even local floods. And how many of you have seen a universal flood? Don't think so. And it really doesn't correlate that well. You double the velocity of the water, the speed of the water, and you increase the carrying and eroding factor by a factor of 12. The power to carry and to erode 12 times when you increase it twice, or increase it once, double it. It doesn't correlate necessarily with just local floods. It works in multiples. But this was his concept, and it allowed him to write the rules well enough 300 years earlier that we still haven't improved on them that much. He understood geology, and this is what he thought was the best explanation. Building on that, the book Genesis Flood was published in 1961 by Whitcomb and Morris, and they explained, in terms of all we know in 1961, and what we've learned since then, I think, just confirms that. And I think they provided an excellent explanation for the geologic record. John C. McCampbell, who was professor and head of the Department of Geology at the University of Southeastern Louisiana, wrote the foreword. Now, he is an evolutionist and a naturalist, but he fairly appraised this explanation and said the facts of geology do fit, and that the authors have built a very strong case for this explanation and a serious challenge to the standard explanation. Now, he didn't say their view fits and ours doesn't, but that's the way I would have said it. I think it explains much more and much better. Well, but how does a flood produce these segregated groups of animals that we do see? And when you look at this column, yes, you see groups that you can identify as the Cambrian, and other groups you can identify as the Silurian. And how did that come to be? You don't find them all in one place, stacked in that beautiful order. Well, when we look at the way animals live in the world today, we see natural, for all rocks that had the early form, no matter how far apart those rocks were geographically, would have to be the same age. So it's not where, but is it early or late in terms of the evolutionary assumption. In this way, our geologic timetable came into being. Without the theory of evolution and the interdisciplinary science of paleontology, it could not exist. So you use evolution to stack, to order the correlation. And then once you get it stacked, you turn around and say, see, the proof of evolution. Well, no, you have to have evolution in order to build it. Now, again, I'm somewhat oversimplifying, and there are correlations in local sequences that you can follow physically, but when you're talking about the whole column, you're talking about correlation across continents and across oceans, and that's strictly based on the assumptions of evolution. The detailed picture in the textbook could not exist without evolution. You must assume the thing to be proved. I think it is useful as a model, but I think we can look at a number of problems with this. Some perhaps you haven't thought about. When you're looking at this, you see mostly vertebrates, obviously, and when people think about fossils, well, yeah, that's the impressive fossils. The truth of the matter, relatively speaking, vertebrates are virtually non-existent relative to the other fossils. This is a very skewed picture. The fossil record, 95% of it, involves marine invertebrates, animals without backbones, and they're in the ocean. And then most of what's not included in the 95%, the other 4.5, is plants and algae. Far less than 1% involves the vertebrates, 0.025%, about 1/100th of 1%. And so when we're talking about this 1.5 miles of sediment that's covering the continents, we're looking primarily at marine invertebrates. Well, why isn't that represented in the geologic column? Somebody might get the idea we're talking about a flood deposit here, a marine flood deposit. Well, yes, that's what it looks like when you represent it correctly, but they don't. The founding fathers of geology all understood that this was a flood deposit, and that's not represented in the textbook as well. Nicholas Steno is referred to as the father of modern stratigraphy. He's one of the heroes of geology, and he'll be in all of the textbooks. Quoting from Dot Batten's textbook, Evolution of the Earth, besides correctly interpreting fossils, the result was formulation of the most basic principles for analysis of Earth history. Steno showed great insight. Almost 300 years ago, he came up with the explanation that we still use today, and he came up with the means of interpreting the strata. And you have to memorize his 12 axioms or you're not going to pass stratigraphy. And if you get a stratigraphy student who's halfway through the course, he can just rattle them off, all 12 of them, because that's the way you do it. They haven't really improved on it that much. He said, well, habitats segregate so that typically you don't find bears and lions living together, do you? Now, you used to back in Bible time, but today you see the ecology has shifted and it's changed. I think the flood buried animals where they lived, and they lived separately from other animals. You don't typically find antelope bones in a coral reef, not because they're millions of years apart, they just live in different places. And as the floodwaters, a worldwide flood engulfed the world, it would bury organisms where they lived, and we would see that as the floodwaters rose and buried these animals, they would preserve that habitat in which they lived, and I think it simply reflects the environment in which you found the world at the time of the flood, and it buried it that way. The different groups were buried separately, not because they're millions of years apart, but because some of them lived on the ocean bottom, and some of them lived up on the edge of the ocean, and some of them lived in the swamps, and some of them lived on the plains. Not all stacked in one place, different places around the world. But typically, if you find a swamp here and an ocean bottom over there, which one is going to be lower? Usually, the ocean bottom. Not always. And so a general order would be predicted, but certainly not this skewed, arranged, conceptual correlation that is pictured so often in the textbooks that is useless as proof of evolution. It's circular logic, which is not useful as proof. It is useful, though, I believe, as a model. Now, what in science, a model is, we understand, the beginning presupposition. Here's an idea. Now, the fact that you illustrate the idea is not proof. But the illustration will serve as a means of testing. And I think that's what the geologic column is useful for. We can test that against the real world to see if the facts fit. And how would you test it? Well, let's allow the evolutionist to describe how this test should proceed. Stephen Stanley of Johns Hopkins refers to topsy-turvy fossils. This would test it, he says. This would disprove evolution. Any topsy-turvy sequence of fossils would force us to rethink our theory. We'll look at a more complete rendition of that quote before we're finished. And by the way, the quotes that we're using are all in a handout that will be available for you, that is here. To illustrate, there are animals that are supposed to be at the bottom of the geologic column that may be found up. That would be a topsy-turvy fossil. Well, animals that are supposed to be down near the bottom early in the development are often found at the top. They're what we call living fossils, and so they really don't like to talk about this part of it that much. Niles Eldridge, a cohort of Stephen Gould, curator of invertebrate paleontology at the American Museum of Natural History, says there seems to have been almost no change in any part we can compare. These animals that began back at the bottom of the column, still alive today, and there's not been any change. He says we've not completely solved the riddle of living fossils. They should have evolved